Okay, Mark, what exactly is Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? Why is it that important? Everybody's talking about it, and what is happening right there now?
Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is the largest nuclear plant in Europe by installed capacity. It is a Soviet built 6 unit pressurized water reactor plant. So that's 6 by 1 gigawatt units, all in a straight line on the Dnieper River in the southeast of Ukraine.
Hmm. hmm. Is this power plant the same one as the one in Chernobyl?
The location is different. The design of the reactors is different. Chernobyl nuclear plant is no longer in operation after the blast at the so-called RBMK reactor
Mhm.
number 4 at Chernobyl nuclear plant in 1986. The other 3 reactors operated for some number of years, with the final reactor at Chernobyl nuclear plant closing in year 2000. The closure in year 2000 was conditional for Ukraine on receiving money to finish reactors at one of their other nuclear plants. Now, all reactors in Ukraine are approximately 1 gigawatt units by power of the Soviet version of the Western pressurized water reactor type.
hmm PWR type reactors, some of the safest type reactors out there, right?
Well, pretty much everything remaining is safe. Certainly, the RBMK reactors that remain in operation today were modified to not blow up like they did at Chernobyl. So, I would argue that that safety today from our nuclear reactors does, of course, come partly from the fundamental design, but also from the training and the professionalism of the operators that are at the plant.
Okay, okay. So now that we know what it is and why it's important, what's going on there right now, and what are the potential dangers?
Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant was captured by Russian forces in the opening days of the war, I believe on day 8 or 9 after the war started. It was a shocking event that was replayed over and over around the world. There was security camera footage that was released from the plant that showed an exchange of fire between security forces of the Ukrainian National Guard based in the employee training building, and then they were being fired upon in return by Russian forces with armored personnel carriers and light arms. So we saw for the first time in world history a firefight over the control of a nuclear plant. Since then, Russian forces have held the plant. The plant is still making electricity, mostly for the Ukraine controlled portion of the country, which is a very weird situation. At last I heard, 2 reactors are online at 50% power out of the 6 at the plant, with one potentially being held at hot ready level. So that means the plant is heated up, the water is pressurized, and it's ready to turn up power, but is not currently making power. I don't know what the exact status of the reactors are today, but the plant personnel have been working under the command and direction of Russian forces, and Rosatom, that is the state Russian nuclear corporation, has sent in staff from a very similar plant to oversee operations at the facility.
Hmm. So what exactly is the risk over there? Because if I remember correctly, PWR reactors don't blow up unless you mention hydrogen.
So even then, we haven't had a destructive hydrogen explosion at a PWR. The hydrogen explosions at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant in 2011 were from a different type of reactor suffering a severe meltdown. What these hydrogen explosions are, by the way, is when water is heated to levels beyond what it can still get to and cool the plant. So heated into steam and steam broken down in contact with very hot fuel rods. Then water is H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen and oxygen separate. The hydrogen can build up to levels that, if not removed, can ignite like the Hindenburg, shall we say. It can blow up. So the buildings around the Fukushima Daiichi units were much less robust by design than the buildings around Zaporizhzhia's pressurized water reactors. So the containment domes around Zaporizhzhia's reactors are 1.2 meters thick, and that's concrete with steel reinforcement
Hmm.
bar, steel rebar, tensioned to make it extremely strong domes that can withstand force from outside and also force from inside if there's any pressure event. And notice I said pressure event rather than explosion. I'm not trying to make it sound like something less serious than it would be, but I'm just trying to make the point that if you have steam come out of the reactor vessel very rapidly, that's something that the pressure dome is designed for. If you had hydrogen build up, and there's equipment in the domes to remove the hydrogen, to recombine it to make water again, almost like a sort of fuel cell. Well, if there was a failure of those somehow, and then hydrogen build up, that hydrogen explosion would also be contained within the pressure dome, within the containment structure.
Right. So this nuclear power plant specifically can withstand rocket attacks from the outside and shelling and all that might be going on there now.
We can destroy, humans, military forces can destroy structures of arbitrary thickness. So an intentional targeted attack by heavy munitions, perhaps a bunker buster, so-called bunker buster bombs, or cruise missiles repeatedly aimed at the domes themselves, could breach the structures, could damage the structures and release their airtight seal. So if that were combined, along with a melting of the fuel in the reactor, and perhaps a destruction of the seal of the primary loop of the reactor, that is the reactor vessel and the pipes leading around it to the steam generators, then with that sequence of events, you could imagine a plume of radioactivity coming from the plant.
How probable is that? Well, would the Russians or the Ukrainians want to do something like that?
Well, we've seen an escalation to previously unimaginable levels during this war. It doesn't make a lot of sense why that would happen. It would be difficult to imagine that occurring when, say, Russia is trying to build very similar reactors around the world, but I try not to speculate whether they're going to do that. Instead, I would focus on this. Ukraine is going to keep operating its other nuclear plants of the same design, no matter what happens at Zaporizhzhia. Russia is going to keep operating its nuclear plants, both of the Chernobyl design and of the Zaporizhzhia design, regardless of what happens. So the two countries locked in combat here, they're going to keep using nuclear energy. I guess the question is, although I don't see it likely that such an extreme escalation would occur, I see it entirely possible that with repeated shelling of the city by some forces, appears to be Russian forces, possibly as a false flag attack, is what we've been seeing, small caliber shelling of the plant from the city itself. It's not clear whether much more than a bit of radiation would come out, but at that point we should ask the question, what will the effect be on nuclear plants that are not in Russia and Ukraine? Russia and Ukraine aren't going to shut theirs. The question is, what will the effect be on the broader world of fear emerging from some leak of some amount of radioactive material from Zaporizhzhia?
Well, you asked the question now. Can you answer it?
Yeah, so I think that we will see some countries justify decisions that they were intending to take anyway to close nuclear as being related to what Russia is doing to Ukraine. It won't make any sense. It will be damaging to Ukraine because these are likely to be European countries that rely on natural gas supplies in common in a European market. And if they switch off nuclear and go towards natural gas, then that reduces the amount available for other countries, especially in the absence of natural gas coming from Russia. So although countries will use the excuse to do what they were going to do anyway and blame it on the Ukraine and Russia conflict, it will of course hurt Ukraine. And I think that the tolerance level of their own citizens to suffer in an energy crisis will be lower than they were before the war. Does that make sense? So in other words, we may see some shutdowns that we've been trying to stop. They may be blamed on Ukraine and Russia, but it's unlikely to have been a decisive factor. I think the much more important thing that I'm expecting to see is that the continual drumbeat of stories, scary stories, and misleading news headlines from around the world, for example, from Al Jazeera that the plant could blow up, maybe, those stories are like crying wolf. And we have a story about a kid who cries wolf, says there's a wolf coming, there's a wolf coming, because he thinks it's funny when everybody runs and says, where is it, we'll protect you. Well, the end of that morality tale for kids is that the final time there is a wolf, the kid cries wolf, and the adults don't come, and the kid gets eaten by the wolf. Now, that's not we don't want to see the wolf eat somebody. We don't want to see meltdown, contained or not. We don't want to see an attack on the containment vessel. But it will be true, this is what I believe, it will be true that after 6 months of stories about how there's imminent nuclear meltdown or danger, any event that does happen, along with its likely zero casualties, as most nuclear accidents have been in world history, will train the public to be slower to respond to nuclear scare stories, to downplay the dangers in headlines, which I think is an appropriate response to the engineering reality. And I think ultimately, nuclear energy is going to come out stronger from this terrible test of its staying power.
Mm-hmm. And that's stronger in the public's eyes because what we saw is that war-torn Ukraine offered Germany, a very well-developed nation, to supply them with energy from their nuclear power plants, which was a hilarious yet sad in the same way thing that happened. But it did prove them
Antonio,
nuclear,
only a year ago, Germany was offering to defend Ukraine with wind turbines.
right?
Peter Altmaier, then a minister, offered to help Ukraine get renewables in order to be less dependent on Russia. Of course, they're not dependent on Russia. They have their own nuclear plants and they're getting fuel from the West now. So it's kind of funny that German minister would be so confused. But yes, I think it was an appropriate return response during a war for Ukraine to offer its surplus nuclear generating capacity for sale to Germany.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in conclusion, what's happening right now is more of a news story than it is a potential real danger.
Well, hold up. Real danger for plant staff who have to walk between buildings during shelling of the
Yeah.
plant. You're not going to breach the containment domes by accident. None of the heavy structures are going to be severely damaged beyond function by accident. But we should absolutely be concerned for the brave defenders and operators of that plant if they're being shelled to produce false fact videos by the Russians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also heard something about Russia trying to attach the plant to its own grid, to the Crimean grid. But the article also said that they are running it at something like an extreme risk because they might need to cut the power to the reactor coolant or something along those lines. Do you know something about that?
Right. So nuclear plants are typically designed to not directly use their own power. They're designed to put a huge amount of high voltage power on the grid, and they're designed to use back some smaller amount of power from the local grid to run their operations. I mean, on balance, of course, it's an enormous surplus of energy. But in the case of Zaporizhzhia, because of the design of the Soviet grid, there's not an effective way to get power from Zaporizhzhia to the local grid and then back to Zaporizhzhia. If you're shutting down the plant and shutting it down entirely, you're having to basically lose energy to the entire local grid. And it's quite difficult to bring in enough power from further away. That power would need to come from Ukrainian controlled areas.
Mm-hmm.
So the worry is at the moment you shut down a plant, whatever the power level it was in the reactor, you have some remaining amount of that power as decay heat. That is slower fissions that take some time to keep breaking apart. And then in longer than a few seconds, you have radioactive decay from the fission products that were produced during the operation of the reactor. These products will continue to decay for some time, and that means you have to keep removing heat from the reactor vessel. The concern is, can you get enough power from the backup generators, not the grid, that won't be able to help you here. Will you be able to get enough power from the backup generators? Each of the 6 units have 3 backup generators. Each of these generator sets can power groups of the other reactors, with the exception, I believe, that reactor 5 and 6 generators are just tied to reactors 5 and 6. So you see, when you add up all of these situations, you see that although you would be able to likely cool the reactors and prevent any long term damage or need for repairs later after the war, it's not absolutely certain in a wartime setting with shelling going on.
Do you think this is the biggest story in nuclear today, or is there something more important that you see going on?
Honestly, it is, but perhaps the bigger story, the second half of this big story, is the lack of fear around the world compared to what it would have been out of the context of a war for this same shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant to be occurring last year.
Hmm.
I think that's extraordinary, and it explains something very deep. Reveals, and then I suppose we explain if we understand what we're seeing, something very deep about nuclear fear itself. That nuclear fear is not based on actual events happening. If anything, actual events happening lower nuclear fear.
Would it take
Produces a spike and then lowers.
exactly? That's what that's what I was thinking about. But what would it take? Would it take an energy crisis for people to actually realize that and to make nuclear fear go away?
Uh, Depends on the population, depends on the severity of the crisis. I think what we're seeing in Germany is the answer is yes. Polling is extremely positive towards nuclear energy. There's probably a bunch of Germans who say, maybe even if we shut down our plants, we should return to nuclear in the future. Germany is an extremely capable country. It's an extremely rich country. For them to be on side nuclear, regardless of what they do to their own plants, is a huge advantage. Just like for Germans and German institutions and German capital to be anti-nuclear in years past was devastating for nuclear plants, despite the importance of nuclear to the rest of the world.